House of Representatives has passed, on a party line vote, an energy regulatory framework that includes the goal of 100% carbon-free electricity production by the year 2040. The Senate is poised to take action in the coming days. Senator Andrew Mathews is the ranking minority member of the Senate Energy, Utilities, Environment, and Climate Committee, and he now joins me to offer his perspective. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Opponents of the measure are calling this the blackout bill. What does that mean?
It addresses some of the top concerns with this bill: the reliability and affordability of energy in the state of Minnesota. And the blackout bill is the title given because we're going to take a lot of baseload generation off the grid, out of Minnesota's mix, replace it with a lot of wind and solar and other renewables in the mix. And just from a math standpoint, if we don't have the sufficient baseload that we need, Minnesota will be at a strong risk for blackouts in the future.
Perhaps because the House Republican caucus rejected the bill, I can imagine that the Senate Republican caucus may also reject this bill when it comes on the floor. What is your primary objection to the measure?
Yes, I don't believe there will be much support in the Republican caucus, and this version is very different from previous renewable energy standards that have passed through, like the 2007 bill. When we have done significant changes like this before, there has been a lot of collaboration, there has been a lot of bipartisanship, working together, making sure all sides were heard, and the 2007 bill, for an example, got a large bipartisan vote in both the House and the Senate. And they are not doing that this year. They have run it through. It was a party line vote in the House. It probably will be or very close in the Senate. And there's a lot of concerns still being ignored that go to the reliability, that go to affordability, that go to the ability of some of our energy generating organizations, from the utilities like Xcel and Minnesota Power to the smaller co-ops or the small town munis in rural Minnesota. They still have a lot of concerns about what their ability will look like to be able to provide affordable electricity to their small rural town or to their community or their co-op region that they have. And there are still a lot of unanswered questions that are not being addressed with this bill that's being run through at a rapid pace still in the first month of the session.
Last year, now retired Senator David Senjem held hearings on the advancing technology in nuclear energy production. If I remember correctly, you authored a bill last year that would have lifted the moratorium on nuclear power expansion here in Minnesota. In your view, should that be part of the mix? That
absolutely should be part of the mix. We had a nuclear and a climate expert in that committee last year who basically said, if you are serious about climate change but are not going to lift the nuclear moratorium in your state, then you're not really serious. It absolutely needs to be a part of the mix because that will be the strongest remaining completely clean source of energy. Nuclear is strong, reliable, it's always on, 24/7, generates basically the same amount of power around the clock. Wind and solar are dependent on the weather. I even looked today before I came here. It's a very cold day today. The sun is shining, but right now for Minnesota and our region, nuclear, coal, and gas are providing 85% of the energy that's powering our electricity right now in real time today. Solar is producing about 1.5% on a sunny winter day. There's just still some problems and issues with how reliable these sources can be. And so if we're going to move to a 100% standard, nuclear absolutely needs to be a part of that mix with the 2 nuclear plants we have, and we need to look at expanding it.
There's language in the bill that instructs the Public Utilities Commission to prioritize the hiring of workers in areas where facilities are being retired. You represent Becker, where all 3 coal-fired power plants are scheduled to be decommissioned in the coming years. Do you approve of the goal of ensuring that those workers are prioritized in any new efforts?
Yeah, it's a tough subject for my community. that is better than nothing, is basically the view that I get from my hometown often. I think many people there would prefer to keep that plant there, keep those jobs there. It has sustained a lot of families in the region, and it has provided a lot of energy for most of the state of Minnesota. And unfortunately, decisions have been made to retire these plants and start winding them down. So with that in mind, yes, I do support these programs that are going to help the workers in this interim, but it's basically the last good option out of bad options remaining, in my view.
North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum has threatened a lawsuit against the state of Minnesota over some of the provisions in the bill. What's your perspective on the potential of that lawsuit from a neighboring state over the carbon issues?
I think they have a really good case. Here's why. The underlying bill is going to try to regulate what companies do generating electricity outside of our state boundaries. They want to control their behavior and how they generate outside of Minnesota. And that's unconstitutional under the Dormant Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And I know that gets into legalese and constitutional terminology. But that is a clear violation. A state cannot regulate what someone does in another state. North Dakota already has a history. There was a proposal about 6 to 8 years ago where they sued Minnesota over something similar, a regulation we tried to, that would impact what companies did in their state. They sued the state of Minnesota. They won. Minnesota had to pay over $1 million out of taxpayer dollars in the legal fees paying for that suit. The likely path is going to happen again. North Dakota likely will file suit if this gets enacted into law, and they will probably win. And we have brought the concerns to the Democrat majority and to the governor. They've made a small tweak in the language, and they are saying that it covers it, but it really doesn't. North Dakota has affirmed that's not really making a substantive change to the issue. And so I think they have a strong constitutional grounds against Minnesota. We're going to bring that issue up again in the debate. It's fallen on deaf ears so far, but I'm hoping that we get a different response.
Just briefly before we have to go, what kinds of changes would need to be made to the bill in order for it to achieve your support? Or if it were up to you, what would be your approach? But briefly.
Here would be my plan. Obviously, the nuclear moratorium needs to be lifted, and then we need to study how it can best grow in the state of Minnesota. Then we should not be closing our baseload generation in the state until we have something sizable and permanent and reliable enough to replace it with. And then we need to study the rates. They're baked in right now that we're paying a high cost in our rates for renewable energy, even though they only give us intermittent energy dependent on the weather. And then we need to look at the affordability cost. One piece from the 2007 bill that the proponents haven't refuted is that passing that mandate back then did increase the cost on Minnesotans. We're above the national average for electricity costs. We're growing faster than the national average, and I believe we'll continue even faster with this 100% mandate. So all of that needs to be looked at, and that would be my plan.
Senator Andrew Mathews, I want to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
This week